"Come on, old man. We don't have all day." The younger rigger's voice carried across the construction site, drawing laughs from the crew gathered near the crane. 64-year-old Ben Kowalski didn't look up. His weathered fingers continued their slow, deliberate work, threading a backup safety line through the load with the patience of a man who'd forgotten how to rush. "My grandmother ties faster than that," someone else called out. More laughter. Ben's hands never wavered. Loop over loop, tension checked, dressed and set. 38 years of muscle memory moving at exactly the speed it needed to move. If you believe that doing things right matters more than doing things fast, type "respect" in the comments right now. Ben Kowalski had started rigging in 1986, back when the Minneapolis skyline was still low enough to see the horizon from downtown. He'd learned from men who'd learned from their fathers, ironworkers and riggers who treated rope and steel cable like extensions of their own hands. In those days, you didn't touch a crane load until you understood every knot in the book, until you could tie a bowline in the dark, until you respected the physics of weight and tension the way a surgeon respects a beating heart. Times had changed. Quick-release clamps and mechanical fasteners had replaced most of the old methods. Faster, more efficient. Progress, they called it. Ben didn't argue with progress. He simply continued doing what he'd always done, adding his own backup lines to every critical lift, tying knots that younger workers didn't recognize and couldn't name. The foreman tolerated it because his safety record was spotless. The younger crews tolerated it less graciously. The Whitmore Tower project was the largest commercial build in the city that year, 42 stories of glass and steel rising from a foundation that had taken 18 months to pour. Ben had been brought on specifically for the heavy lifts, the structural steel placements that required precision measured in fractions of inches. He worked alongside a crew half his age, men who'd grown up with hydraulic systems and digital load calculators, who trusted machines the way Ben trusted his hands. The morning of October 17th started like any other. A 2-ton steel beam needed to be lifted from the staging area to the 24th floor, where ironworkers waited to bolt it into place. The crane operator ran through his checks. The primary rigging team attached the main cable and load clamps with practiced speed. Ben followed behind them, slower, quieter, threading his backup line through the beam's lifting lugs and beginning his knot work. That's when the comments started. "Kowalski, seriously, the crane's ready. What are you doing?" The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, the lead rigger for the day shift. 29 years old, confident and impatient. He'd never liked Ben's methods, viewing them as relics of an obsolete era. "Backup line," Ben replied, without looking up. "The clamps are rated for 6 tons. We're lifting 2. We don't need your arts and crafts project." Marcus gestured to the waiting crane operator. "Hook it up. We're burning daylight." Ben continued tying. A double fisherman's bend into a tensioned loop, the kind of knot that actually tightens under load rather than slipping. The crew gathered, some smirking, others checking their phones. Someone made a joke about Ben still using a rotary phone at home. Someone else suggested they get him a rocking chair for the job site. Ben finished his knot, checked the tail length, and stepped back. "She's ready." Marcus rolled his eyes. "Finally. All clear. Take her up." The crane's engine groaned as the cable went taut. The 2-ton beam lifted smoothly from the staging platform, swinging slightly as it cleared the ground. The operator began the rotation toward the tower, the load rising steadily past the 10th floor, then the 15th. Everything was routine. Everything was exactly as it should be. Ben watched from below, his eyes not on the beam but on the main cable where it connected to the crane's hook assembly. He'd seen something during the attachment that bothered him, a slight irregularity in one of the cable strands near the ferrule. He'd mentioned it to Marcus. Marcus had told him the cable had been inspected last week. Ben hadn't argued. He'd simply tied his knot a little tighter. At the 22nd floor, 240 feet above the ground, The irregularity Ben had noticed became a failure. The frayed strand separated. Then another. The main cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot echoing off the surrounding buildings. 2 tons of structural steel dropped. The quick-release clamps, designed to hold the load secure during the lift, were never meant to catch a falling beam. The shock load exceeded their rating in a millisecond. The first clamp sheared its bolt. The second followed. The beam plummeted, spinning now, falling toward the staging area where 3 workers stood frozen in the paralysis of sudden terror. And then it stopped. Ben's backup line, that slow, methodical, mocked piece of rope work, caught the load exactly as it was designed to. The double fisherman's bend cinched tight under the shock, the tensioned loop absorbing the energy through friction and fiber in a way no mechanical clamp could replicate. The beam jerked to a halt 11 feet above the ground, swinging wildly but held, the backup line groaning but intact. Directly beneath it, a young apprentice named Danny Flores stood with his hard hat knocked off by the wind of the near miss, staring up at 2 tons of steel hanging inches above where his head had been. The sight went silent, the kind of silence that follows near death, when the brain hasn't yet processed that survival has occurred. Ben was already moving, calling out commands with an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his quiet demeanor usually allowed. Nobody. Move. Operator, hold position. Marcus, get a secondary crane on that beam now. Danny, son, walk toward me. Slowly. The young apprentice couldn't move. His legs had locked. Ben walked to him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and guided him step by step out from beneath the suspended load. Only when Danny was clear did Ben allow himself to look up at the knot that had held. The rope fibers were stressed, some frayed from the shock, but the knot itself had done exactly what 40 years of experience told him it would do. It had tightened. It had caught. It had saved a life. The investigation took 3 days. Inspectors examined the failed cable and found corrosion damage that the previous week's inspection had missed, hidden beneath the ferrule where visual checks couldn't reach. They examined the quick-release clamps and confirmed they'd performed within their specifications, which simply weren't designed for shock loading from a cable failure. And they examined Ben's backup line, his slow, deliberate, mocked piece of rigging work. The inspector, a veteran himself, recognized the knot immediately. Double fisherman's with a tensioned loop. Old school, you don't see that much anymore. Ben shrugged. You don't see it because people stopped teaching it. Doesn't mean it stopped working. The inspector nodded slowly. That knot's been holding loads since before electricity. Good thing somebody still remembers how to tie it. The report concluded that without the backup line, the falling beam would have struck the staging area with fatal results. Ben Kowalski's knot hadn't just held. It had prevented a workplace death. The memorial service happened anyway. Not for a person, but for what could have been. The site superintendent gathered the entire crew at the staging area 3 days after the incident, standing in the exact spot where Danny Flores had nearly died. He didn't lecture. He didn't assign blame beyond what the investigation had already determined. He simply asked Ben Kowalski to come forward and explain what he'd done and why. Ben wasn't comfortable with attention. He never had been, but he understood why this mattered. He stood before 53 construction workers, some of whom had mocked him, and spoke quietly about redundancy, about respecting the physics of load and failure, about the old methods that had kept men alive before computers and clamps and quick-release mechanisms. He spoke about the riggers who'd trained him, men long dead now, whose voices he still heard every time he threaded a rope through a lifting lug. And then he said something that nobody on that site would ever forget. Speed kills, not save. 5 words. Ben turned and walked back to his position, picked up a coil of rope, and began preparing for the next lift. The crew watched him go in silence. Marcus Webb, the lead rigger who dismissed him that morning, stood motionless for a long moment before walking over to where Ben worked. He didn't apologize with words. He simply picked up a length of rope and said, "Show me how to tie that knot." Ben looked at him, nodded once, and began to teach. Over the following weeks, something shifted on the Whitmore Tower project. The jokes stopped. The impatience faded. Younger workers started arriving early to watch Ben prepare his rigging, asking questions, learning names for knots they'd never been taught. The quick-release clamps remained in use, approved and efficient, but now they were backed up by hands that understood why the old ways had survived. Ben Kowalski retired 8 months later, his safety record still spotless. Danny Flores spoke at his farewell gathering, voice breaking, holding up a piece of rope with a double fisherman's bend tied perfectly in its center. Some lessons can't be rushed, some skills can't be replaced by technology, and some old men, quiet and slow and easy to dismiss, carry knowledge in their hands that can mean the difference between a near miss and a tragedy. Ben Kowalski never sought recognition for what he did that October morning. He simply did what he'd always done, what he'd been trained to do by men who understood that in work where lives hang in the balance, patience isn't a weakness, it's the whole point. If this story reminded you that experience deserves respect, that the slow and steady sometimes save us all, then subscribe to this channel. Because every week, we share stories of quiet heroes, of wisdom earned through decades of dedication, and of the moments that prove why we should never mock what we don't yet understand.